Alright, hello guys, welcome to my presentation on feeding relationships. This is basically going to be dealing with food chains and food webs, their construction, their dynamics, and so on and so forth. So basically what we're going to be doing this for right now, we're going to define what a food chain is, identify the positions of producers, consumers in food chains, identify each type of habitat containing at least 4 organisms, identify from each habitat herbivores, carnivores, omnivores, identify from each habitat predator-prey and predator-prey relationships, and finally construct food web to include different trophic levels. So we're basically looking at what interrelationships are between the organisms and their environment. So to begin with, we're going to look at, just lay this out straight, that within any ecosystem there exists many kinds of relationships between organisms, different relationships, and these relationships can be beneficial and they can also be harmful. So based on the picture that you're looking at right now on your screen, you'd see a crocodile and a bird, and right there instinctively you would probably just say that the crocodile is going to eat the bird, but that is not so, and they actually share a very beneficial relationship. But we will look further on that as we progress. I also have this picture right here. This is a relationship. This is actually a Photoshop image, but you can get the picture, you can get the storyline here. This is not a beneficial relationship, so unlike the one that we see before that we would think would have been negative, it has actually is positive for both. And this is positive for one, and you can guess what that one organism will be. Anyway, so we're looking now on feeding relationships. So organisms in an ecosystem are linked to form food chains based on how they obtain their energy. And the energy that we're talking about here is food, right? So I want you now to take your pen and your notepad, and you're going to make sure you write down these definitions as we go through. So the first one we're going to write down here is the definition for a food chain. So if you look at the bottom of the screen there, you see in green the sequence of organisms through which energy passes in the form of food. That is what we call a food chain. So a food chain is a sequence of organisms through which energy passes in the form of food. Alright? Now, energy from the sun enters living organisms through a process called photosynthesis occurring in green plants. So all the green plants that you can see in your environment, they carry out a process called photosynthesis, and they depend on the sunlight. Right? So they use that sunlight energy. The sunlight is a form of energy, not the most abundant. Well, it's a very abundant form of energy. Now it is inaccessible by us or consumers who feed on other organisms, to get energy. But the plants, they use this light and they convert it into chemical energy, which we know can actually absorb or use. So green plants, because of this ability, are known as primary producers, because what they do is take the sunlight energy and convert it into chemical energy. So if you look on the picture there, you will see some mangoes, and by this you know that it is coming up to the mango season. So all of the mangoes that you're seeing there are as a result of the sunlight energy and other raw materials being converted to make food, right? So the energy is now stored in the plant. It is stored in the fruits of some plants, it is stored in the roots of some plants, in the stems of some plants. Example would be like sugarcane. It's stored in the leaves of some plants, things like callaloo, cabbage, lettuce, broccoli, pak choy. It is stored in the seeds of some plants, things like peanut, beans and peas, coconut, and other parts of the plant, right? So so that energy that the plant makes now is now stored now and is passed on to consumers through food chain. So what happens is that when consumers feed on the plants, they obtain the energy that is stored in there. So the picture there, you can see some goats feeding on the corn. Alright, so consumers now, what are consumers? Consumers are organisms that basically feed on other organisms to obtain energy. Now we have three types of consumers. We have the first type, we call them the primary consumers, animals that eat primary producers. And we don't have to keep on saying primary producers because it might get a little bit tricky to say primary consumers, primary producers, primary you know, and so on. So we can just stick to just producers, because producers are the plants. So primary consumers now are animals that eat producers, or in other words, we could say that animals that eat plants. So animals that eat only plants are classified as herbivores. Once they eat only plants, they are exclusive to eating plants or plant products. We call those herbivores. Therefore, all primary consumers are herbivores. Good. So the first set of organisms that are feeding, first set of consumers that feed on the plants, we call those herbivores. Secondary consumers is another type of consumer now. Animals that eat primary consumers, or in other words, animals that eat other animals, right, are classified as secondary consumers. Now, secondary consumers are also known as carnivores, because carnivores actually eat other animals. Alright, so you can see there the picture with a cat eating a lizard, a dog eating the carcass of a rabbit or some other animal. Right? There are a whole host of carnivores: lions, bears, tigers, even certain birds, right? Mongoose, you know, a lot of animals that you can think of. Just try to remember what they eat as for their main source of food and energy. Final one is the tertiary consumer, animals that eat secondary consumers. Now, tertiary consumers are the same, carnivores. Alright, so basically it's just another set of carnivores that eat other carnivores. So therefore, tertiary consumers, they, as I said before, they are carnivores. But you have some other consumers now. There's another group that we classify consumers into, and that is omnivores. And what omnivores do is that they are different from carnivores and they are different from herbivores. They actually feed on both plants product and animals, right? So example would be like us humans. We eat both plant products and plants themselves, and we also eat animals and animal products, right? So we fall in the category of omnivores because we eat both plants and animals. You have other animals that do, like pigs. Pigs fall in that category, right? Hummingbirds and so forth, and other birds, other animals, dogs, you know. You can think of a lot of animals that might be in your vicinity that do eat plant products and animal products as well. Alright, so we have three types of consumers. We have the primary consumer, which we say are herbivores. We have the secondary and tertiary consumers, which we say are carnivores, and we can also find omnivores in the mix. Alright, so now let's look at basically the feeding positions that these organisms find themselves. So the level or position that an organism feeds in a food chain, that should be in a food chain, right? is referred to as the trophic level, right? So the level, or let's use the position that an organism feeds in a food chain is referred to as the trophic level. So let's look now. The first trophic level, I'm giving you them in the correct order. The first trophic level would be the producer trophic level. So the producer is important. Every food chain must start with a producer. Please make sure you note that. Every food chain must start with a producer. Then next we have the primary consumer. Now the primary consumer, as we said before, is a herbivore. So it's the organism that is going to feed on the plant. Then we have the secondary consumer, which is a carnivore, or it could be an omnivore. And then we have the tertiary consumer, right? So the secondary and the tertiary consumer always falls in the carnivore category, alright, but they are set out just like how you see them on your screen there. Note also that I have arrows here. So basically what I'm giving you is the blueprint for a food chain. So the food chain would be outlined just like this, but it is important that you put your arrows in and your arrowheads. So the arrows show the direction in which the energy is flowing, right? So the energy is flowing from the producer to the primary consumer, to the secondary consumer, all the way up to the tertiary consumer, right? Make sure you note that. So now let's look at some examples of food chains. So for example, you have a callaloo plant that is being fed on by a caterpillar, and that caterpillar is eaten by a chicken, and that young chicken there is under threat from a chicken hawk, right? So this is an example of a food chain, and note that this is a terrestrial food chain. And what we mean by terrestrial, we mean that these are land-based animals. All of these animals are on land, and so is the plant, right? So this is how you would construct your food chain. What you can do at this point is to pause the video and to go ahead and write down at least 2 examples of food chains that you could identify in your environment. So go ahead right now, write down your 2 examples of food chains. If you can find more, that is great, but we can just start with 2, right, based on the example that I have there on screen. Now you should have completed your examples, and we can look at another example just to compare what you have. So this time I'm using a second example here where I have grass as the producer, then I have a grasshopper, then I have lizard, a snake, and a hawk. Alright, so basically the arrows are here pointing the direction of in which the energy is flowing, and I also put in red my trophic levels for all the organisms. Now note in this example I have added another trophic level, one that I did not mention before, and this one is what we call the quaternary consumer. Now the quaternary consumer is like the top carnivore, because you know once you reach secondary, tertiary and quaternary, all of these consumers are going to be classified as carnivores because they are feeding on animals, they're not feeding on any plants. But note also, when we get to another level, we'll see where there is example where actually you can have animals feeding on both plants and other animals. So I've made those outlines. So as long as your example has the direction, the arrows and the arrowheads, and as long as your your food chain has examples of animals that are realistic, because I don't want you to put in grass and then put lizard, because you never see lizard eating grass, but you might see them eating mango fruit or some other product of the plant. So if you're using that where you state that the lizard may be eating plant byproducts, that would be okay. But I want you to understand that the feeding relationship between each organism must be logical and realistic. You can't write so snake eat grass or hawk eat grass, right? So make sure that you have logical organisms. But if you follow the blueprint that I just showed you, so that the plant or the producers are always being fed on by herbivores, and once you can identify a herbivore, then it's going to be correct, and the carnivores will follow. Alright, so that's basically how the food chain is constructed and works. So let's look at now some aquatic examples. Now we won't actually stress a lot of these examples because we're not doing marine biology or anything like that. We don't do much of that, so you might not be familiar with much of the animals that are in marine ecosystems or aquatic ecosystems. But nonetheless, these are a few examples of what aquatic ecosystems, the food chains that are present in those ecosystems. So you can look at them. I want you to pay special attention to the term phytoplankton, and the phytoplankton there is referring to a microscopic form of plant, and this exists in the oceans, right? And those plants, phytoplanktons, are usually fed on by a particular set of herbivores we call zooplanktons. Just like here the term zoo mean animals, so zooplankton refers to these microscopic animals that feed on the phytoplankton, which is a microscopic plant. Alright, and then you know our local parrotfish feeds on these, and then now our local parrotfish is under threat by a particular fish species we call the lionfish. Right, this fish actually is not native to our waters here in the Caribbean. It was actually brought here. I'm not sure if it is through accident or what, but it got here, so it is actually invading in our environment. But we look at that further on. Alright, so predator-prey relationships now are feeding relationships where you have a predator, the one who hunts, and then you have a prey, the one who is being hunted. And these relationships are very easy. We see them every day. Good. So predator-prey relationships. So animals hunt other animals for food. Example: chicken hawk fly around and look for little chickens to catch them and eat them. Lizards look for other little bugs, moths. If you set up your light at night time and you look, you will see the lizards. They come out and they look and they run down and hunt the moth to eat them. The lion hunt in the tundra, in the jungle, in the African Sahara. You can see Sahara, but the African plains and so forth. You will see them. The shark in the ocean, they do the same thing. And I just mentioned this slide before, the lionfish hunting the parrot. Good. So these are examples of predator-prey relationship. When you see your tertiary consumer hunting your secondary consumer, or your quaternary consumer hunting your tertiary consumer, or your secondary consumer hunting the primary consumer, that is the predator-prey relationship. So now what must happen is that these predators must develop special features to catch their prey. They can't just get up and just catch the prey like that. So they will develop things like speed, stealth, camouflage, well-developed senses, sharp teeth, powerful jaws, mouth, and even poison to kill them prey. And what they also do is they develop immunity to the poison that their prey might inject them with when they are hunting them. So these are the things that the predators will develop. So look at this picture here. You can see a cheetah hunting a gazelle, right? So notice a cheetah very fast, can go up to 60 kilometers per hour, and look on a long tail that's used for balance to take a sharp turn to make sure you can catch this animal here. Also look at the lion. Bet you can't see him so clearly, right? So imagine being at a certain distance away. That lion can lie and crawl very close to their prey without the prey being able to notice that they are around, right? So in the same way, or at the same time, the prey must develop certain features to avoid being eaten by the predator. And it is the same thing where you see the predator develop, the prey develop the same thing too. So if the predator develops speed, the prey will develop speed just to run. So if the predator have good sense of hearing and seeing, then the prey going to have good sense of hearing and seeing as well, in order to avoid being eaten. Alright, so um, that's basically how the predator-prey relationship works. So if you look at this picture here, you can see these little what do you call these animals again? Let's call them rabbits for argument's sake, right? Have some real pointed ears, so their ears really sit up like antenna because they're looking around. They have very good sharp, very sharp sense of smell, so they will sniff out that fox before the fox even get close, so that then they shoot underground and avoid being eaten by the fox. Now, predator-prey relationships are often used as biological control. So for those farmers that don't believe in using things like insecticides and pesticides and all those chemicals, they normally use natural methods to control pests. So for example, in the past, what used to happen is that the sugarcane plantations used to suffer from mice and other animals, rodents feeding on the cane and so forth. So what they did was to bring a predator, natural predator to those rodents, which is the mongoose. So they brought the mongoose into the Caribbean, into Jamaica and other Caribbean islands to feed on the rodents, to cut down the rodent population. Alright? So that's an example of how the predator-prey relationship can be used as a biological pest control. Even though in the long run this mongoose actually started to become a predator for other things that the plantation owners did not want. Right? So for example, the little chickens that they used to rear, snakes and so forth, this mongoose started to feed on them as well. Alright guys, so I'm just gonna move on now to the final stage where we're looking at food webs. So what a food web is now is a combination, interlinking of different food chains. So if you look at the picture right there, what you can see is that you have 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. You are seeing one. So from the grains to the birds to the fox, that's a food chain. From the grasses to the grasshopper to the bird, then back to the fox, that's another food chain. Then from the grass to the grasshopper to the owl is a food chain. From the carrot to the rabbit to the fox, it's another food chain. So what you're seeing here is a more realistic representation of the different animals and plants within the ecosystem that are interacting with each other. So the food chain is limited in that it only shows you the relationship between each of those organisms that you can see. One, so the producer and the primary consumer, and the secondary consumer, and the tertiary consumer, only those. But in reality, right, so in the food chain you only see one food source, but in reality it doesn't mean that the primary consumer only eat that particular plant alone. It doesn't mean, so for example, look here, look at the grasshoppers. The grasshopper is eating grains, but it's also eating the grass at the same time. The rabbit is eating carrots, but it's also eating grasses at the same time. So what you're seeing here is that each primary consumer have more than one food source. It's important that you know that, right? So unlike in the food chain where you see one food source for each organism, in the food web, the more realistic view of what is happening in the ecosystem, one animal can have 1, 2 or 3 different food sources. Alright, so how we construct our food web is that we tend to put all our producers at the base level. So when we have all our producers at the base level now, then we go the next level up, we have our primary consumers, and then if you look the next level up, our secondary consumers. But note that these things will always happen where you can find that a secondary consumer can be both a tertiary and a secondary consumer at the same time because he has more than one food source. So let's look at one example of that. You see the grass is here being eaten by grasshopper, good, and then the grasshopper is being eaten by a bird, and then the bird is being eaten by a fox, good. So in this food chain the bird is a secondary consumer. Alright class, but look now, if we have the grass being eaten by the Let me find another example here, or maybe I have to switch to another food chain, food web. But if we go to here, over, let's use the grasshopper again. So the grasshopper is being eaten by the owl, and it's being eaten by a bird. So probably in this food web we're not seeing where an animal is both a secondary and a tertiary consumer. If you see it, very good, because I'm not seeing it right away. So maybe let me move to the next example. So this is another example here of a food web constructed. This one, no pictures, just names. So if we look at the grass being eaten by a grasshopper, then the grasshopper is being eaten by a kingbird, and then the kingbird is being eaten by an hawk. In this case, we have the kingbird being a secondary consumer, but we're going to find another case where this kingbird can be a tertiary consumer. Watch this. The hibiscus leaf being eaten by the caterpillar, being eaten by the lizard, being eaten by a kingbird. So here, producer, here, primary consumer, here, secondary consumer, here, tertiary consumer. But in this one, primary consumer, then secondary consumer. So this gives you an example where the kingbird can be both a secondary consumer and a tertiary consumer within the same ecosystem. Alright, class, so please note all of these things. Try and find ways to link your food chains together. Once you can identify how your food chains are linked together, then you can develop this web, and that's what we call the food web. So in summary, what we can recall from this presentation so far is that the sun, we know that the sun is the ultimate source of all energy, because it is where the producers get their energy from. They use it to make food via a process called photosynthesis, and now animals are able to feed on the plants themselves or the products that they make, and they in turn get food. Now they store that food, and other animals feed on other animals, right? You have predator-prey relationships going on, as well as, animals feeding on the plants, herbivores and so forth. We looked at those. We looked at the fact that consumers can be herbivores, carnivores, and omnivores. They feed on both plants and animals. We looked at the trophic level. We know that we have the first trophic level is a producer, always a green plant that uses sunlight energy via photosynthesis to make food. And then we have the consumers. We have the primary, secondary, tertiary, and in some cases we can have up to quaternary consumers. Alright, class, so that is it. The last thing we finished with was the food web, which is a more realistic view of the interactions occurring in the ecosystem, where we have the different food chains and interlinking together, and we have animals having more than one food source, animals being at more than one trophic level, alright, and all of that occurring. What I want you to do is to construct your food web for your assignment. Just go and construct your food web and tell me what would happen if you should remove one organism from your food web. What kind of impact that can have. And if you go back to right here, so if you're looking at this food web again, if we should remove the grasshopper, let's say, or let's go back to the hibiscus leaf, let's say the caterpillars is a pest and the farmer use pesticides. What will happen if we remove the caterpillar? What will happen if we kill out all the grasshoppers? What if we set the mouse trap and get rid of all of the mice or the mouse in the ecosystem? What implication can that have on the other animals that are there? Alright guys, that's it. Hope you enjoyed this one. Have a good